The opinions expressed on this program represent the viewpoints of individual authors or contributors and do not necessarily reflect those of Troy University.
Hello and welcome to EconVersations. I'm your host, Dr. Dan Sutter of the Johnson Center for Political Economy at Troy University. In late 2019, a new virus emerged in China, sparking fears of a potential worldwide pandemic. While medical researchers work to understand the new virus and public health officials try to work to stem its spread, the outbreak is having significant economic consequences. What are the economic and policy issues raised by pandemics and quarantines? Joining me today on EconVersations to discuss this question is my colleague from the Johnson Center, Dr. Steve Miller, who is the Adams Bibby Professor of Economics at Troy. Welcome back to the show, Steve.
Thanks, Dan.
And today we're going to change things up, and you're going to ask me the questions. And I just want to preface for everyone here before we get started to say that I'm not a medical doctor, I'm not an epidemiologist. I'll be sharing information about those aspects of the disease that I've learned from other sites, primarily the Centers for Disease Control's website.
Okay. Well, so Dan, tell me a little bit about the background of the new virus and where do we stand today?
Well, the virus is a version, a new variant of what's known as the coronavirus, which is a family of different viruses. The SARS virus epidemic that you might remember from 2002, 2003 is a coronavirus. The MERS virus, which has affected the Middle East, is also another variant of the coronavirus. The virus was first noted in or around the city of Wuhan in China, which is in the province of Hubei. So just to give you a little perspective there, it's I think about 600 miles or so south of Beijing. It seems to have, like as with SARS and MERS that had their origins in bats, this seems to have been a virus that began in animals or possibly fish, because there seems to be some linkage to a seafood market. It started first apparently getting people were catching it from animals, but it's since begun to spread from person to person, which is always the fear that epidemiologists have when a new virus emerges from the animals into people.
Okay. So it's an interesting question about whether the concern that people have, especially in the U.S., might be overblown. So, for example, in the U.S. last flu season, there were 34 million cases of the flu and 34,000 deaths. That's a lot of deaths, but it's a relatively small portion. And to date in the U.S., there haven't been any deaths from the coronavirus. So is this just something that the media is focusing on and it makes people scared, or is there more to the story?
Well, there is something to know in that I think the media often focuses on something that's new or different, whereas the things that are normal that tend to occur frequently do not get a lot of attention. So this is maps from the CDC showing where the cases have been confirmed globally, and then also here in the United States, the states where we have confirmed cases. And to date, more than 40,000 cases have been confirmed globally, and over 900 deaths. Only 2 of the deaths, at least as of today, when I started checking on this, have been reported outside the United States, and none in the United States. And if this flu season is going like last flu season, then over the last month or so that we've been hearing all the news stories about the coronavirus, there's probably been thousands of deaths in the United States from the regular flu. Now, is this overhype of the coronavirus? Well, I mean, perhaps in a sense it is, but there's also the cases that the flu is very sort of predictable. The annual flu is very predictable, and although its numbers of victims are perhaps about the same as the number of Americans who die in auto accidents every year, because it's relatively predictable, and because many of the victims are very young or very old, who have somewhat weakened immune systems to begin with, And because of the nature of it, it's unlikely, although it's to produce a large, 30 or 40,000 deaths every year. It's not the kind of thing that's going to cause, say hundreds of thousands of deaths. So it's always going to be that new virus because with the flu, although it varies from year to year, people have had it before. We have some immunity to it, and so there are some drugs that work pretty well to help fight some of the symptoms. And like I said, primarily in terms of being fatal is for the relatively elderly with compromised immune systems to begin with. If you're a healthy adult, then you have relatively little to fear from the flu. Whereas for a new virus that we simply don't know how deadly it might turn out to be, how easily it might be transmitted, it's uncertain, and that uncertainty creates the possibility for some possible extreme, terrible event.
Right, and historically there have been pandemics that have been very catastrophic. So
yes, yeah, very much.
There is that potential.
Yeah. So history certainly shows this. The bubonic plague, when it hit Europe, apparently it came from Asia in the mid 14th century. It wiped out anywhere from 30 to 60% of the population of Europe within a span of about 4 to 6 years. Wow. Which, if you think about that, is just and across all of Europe. It was just tremendously devastating. Many Native American tribes, when they came in contact with European settlers or European traders, contracted smallpox and other diseases which Europeans had been exposed to for some time, but that the Native Americans had never been exposed to, and like a quarter or possibly a half of some of these tribes died in their sort of first exposure to these new viruses. And then in 1919, just over 100 years ago, there's the worldwide pandemic from the Spanish influenza. Influenza virus that killed over 50 million people worldwide, including over 600,000 in the United States. And one of the things that, in addition to the extent of that outbreak and the number of deaths, and that was a case of an influenza where many of the victims were adults in their prime years, and so that was quite unusual compared to other cases of the flu.
Okay, so one thing a case of a new virus like this and the potential for a pandemic presents is the need for medical research capability to combat it effectively. What are some ways medical researchers learn about this new virus?
Well, yeah, and that it's really important because when we encounter something new, we don't know what it is, and researchers have to try to understand what it is. And the Centers for Disease Control have already been able to post the entire genome of the virus, and that's been made available for researchers around the globe. That's why we sort of know it's similar to SARS and MERS in particular. So we've been able to look at the genetic structure of it. The CDC has been able to develop a test to be able to test people to see if they are actually infected by this, and that can be done at laboratories now across the country. It's a complicated test, so it can only be done really sort of at specialized laboratories as opposed to at every hospital. And the CDC has grown the virus in cell cultures, which means that we now have enough of the virus available for research purposes. That then they're sharing that with researchers across the globe who are going to investigate to try to see what kind of drugs might be effective in trying to treat it. Is there some way to possibly develop a vaccine? Also things to be able to explore how it is that this is actually affecting people and sickening people. And then we can also study to see how long the virus might remain contagious, say on surfaces and so forth, and what would be the best way to decontaminate or kill for the virus to help prevent its spread. So knowledge is the key, and we really need to have medical research at our disposal to address things like this. Right,
because sometimes a lot of times with health economics, we tend to think of it being an allocation problem where how do we get health care and medicine to people who need it. And we think in terms, we think statically in terms of existing technology, but you're speaking about the importance of research. And so what are the health economics concerning the question of research? How do you incentivize research? How do you make sure that research is happening and that there's a research infrastructure capable of dealing with new diseases or mutating diseases?
Yeah, and that's crucially important, because I mean, it's not just we do have new diseases that arise. What wasn't that 30 or I guess maybe 40 years ago, we saw the AIDS virus emerge, and that was completely unknown at the time. That was a new virus. So this isn't the last time. It's not the first time. We do have this problem now. If we did know, if we did know that we didn't need any additional research, then there are ways we could try to make access to drugs available to more people. And in particular, one of the ways which pharmaceutical companies pay for the development of new drugs is off of profits for the drugs that they've already introduced. And because most of the knowledge, most of the cost of developing a new drug is in the testing of it, the recognizing that what chemical formula will actually produce a drug that will help fight disease in humans. Most of the cost gets expended on the front end to try to develop to try to do the testing and to confirm its ability. Once we know that a formula works, the cost of the chemicals and to mix them together in the proper way is relatively low. So in theory, if we really wanted to, if we knew we didn't need any new drugs, we could always step in and put price controls on drugs and make pharmaceutical companies sell the drugs that they've already developed at basically their cost of production. That would lower the cost of making the drugs that we all the different wonder drugs we currently have available to patients across the country, but it would also mean that it would be the end of, in a sense, any kind of private investment in future drugs.
Interesting. It reminds me of a paper by a famous economist. I could say Milton Keynes, but that's not really an economist. But it's Hayek. It's this idea of competition as a discovery procedure. Yeah. Talk about discovery in economics and how that's relevant here.
Yeah, because in short, economists talk about discovery, and it's something that many economists sort of don't necessarily understand the full implications of it. But I guess the short way of describing it is that everything that we currently know about the world had to be learned at some point in time.
Right.
And it's very deceptive because we know so much about things now that we don't often recognize that we're ever in this sort of position of fundamental ignorance. So and it takes something new. When a new virus comes along, and we realize we don't know anything. We know very little about this. We don't know how easily it's going to spread from person to person. We don't know what the mortality rate is going to end up being. We don't know any of these other things. This puts us in this position of fundamental ignorance. But we're actually in this position all the time in economics, in addition to medicine or public health. And because it really is the case, we have to discover what are resources, what goods and services can be produced, and what goods and services people value. And that's always changing. We're coming up with new products, new services, and new ways of producing things and organizing economic activity all the time. Everything that we know, we have to discover at some point in time.
Right. I mean, it sounds like you need a dynamic economy and a dynamic resource infrastructure to be able to deal with new threats.
Very much, very much.
Let's change gears a little bit and talk about kind of almost macroeconomics, the macroeconomic impact of the coronavirus, right? Much of the impact in China has been economic. Factories have been shut down for several weeks now. How does that affect the global economy?
Well, it's going to have a pretty significant effect. Two of the industries that have been heavily concentrated around Wuhan are automobiles, and then also cell phone production. A lot of Apple's factories producing cell phones in China are located around Wuhan, and Foxconn, which produces a lot of phones for Apple, is also heavily located there. And the impacts are going to be pretty significant. Honda, I think, has 3 plants located around Wuhan. And Hyundai has recently announced that they have had to idle or has shut down a plant in South Korea because they're not getting parts out. So in addition to the factories that are assembling automobiles in that part of China, many of the part suppliers are located in China as well, and those part suppliers have had to shut down, which means that we are going to see things like Hyundai having shut down production in a plant in South Korea.
That's interesting. I mean, if you think about it, that could even impact production here in Alabama. How much could this end up costing the global economy?
It's hard to know because in large part it depends on just exactly how bad the outbreak ends up being. At this point, the World Health Organization hasn't declared it to be a full-blown pandemic, but certainly with the factories being shut down in China, and then also transportation being disrupted as well. Airlines have canceled flights into China, so that means that many commercial flights also carry cargo out, and so that's shut down much of the ability to transport parts out of China. We know that the SARS outbreak, which happened about 17 years ago, cost the economies in Asia anywhere from about $33 to $44 billion. And at that time, China's economy was about 4% of the world economy. And now China's economy is closer to about 16% of the world economy. So, and at this point in time, the number of deaths from the new coronavirus strain has passed the number that we had with SARS, and it doesn't seem to be slowing down at this point. So it seems like it's going to be a worse outbreak. China's a much bigger part of the global economy, that the cost could be pretty significant. The World Bank has done some estimates to suggest that a major global pandemic could cost as much as 5% of global GDP, in addition to obviously the obvious health effects that we wouldn't want to overlook.
Yeah, you mentioned the disruption of supply chains and even it affecting a Hyundai plant in South Korea because they can't get parts. How complex are these supply chains?
They're really quite involved. There are estimated to be like 30,000 parts that go into a final automobile, and they are made by hundreds of different suppliers located all across the globe. The modern global supply chain is a real testament to both economics and business, but also it's in many ways a testament to the how predictable and how peaceful our economy is in the world today. A global supply chain is easily disrupted due to extreme weather or earthquakes, volcanoes, any kind of military conflict could immediately threaten a supply chain. So the fact that before companies are even willing to go ahead and set up a global supply chain, it really shows the extent to which Apple is willing to produce cell phones in China because they really don't anticipate that there's going to be any disruption. If you really thought that that your production would get disrupted, you wouldn't locate factories in a place, or you wouldn't contract with people who are building factories there. So we have these exceedingly complex global supply chains, and in many ways that's a very good thing because it shows just to what extent our global economy is a place where businesses can plan and can actually decide that they're going to undertake investments where they have to rely on shipping across oceans or across all this time to be able to keep producing products.
I mean, to me, the complexity of the production process and the complexity of the supply chains and how it's gotten even more complex over time. I would say 100 years ago it was far more complex than most people could imagine or truly could realize. And now it truly is. It's many tens of thousands of parts in an automobile, for instance, produced all over the globe. But what that suggests to me is that there's so much more potential for value creation now with the current supply chains the way they are. And it really is the engine of prosperity.
It definitely is.
The question then, this makes me think about the role of government, right? I mean, when you have something like this, clearly there's room in economic theory for a role of government to intervene when markets are disrupted in this way. free market economists and libertarians are sometimes bothered by this idea, but public health has traditionally been a task for the government. So how are we relying on the government to contain the outbreak?
Well, traditionally, as we mentioned, we've turned to the government for public health, and in particular because the governments would have the ability to enforce quarantines or isolation on people, or even if you had a vaccine, a mandate, have mandatory vaccination. And although some free market economists might be a little troubled by this, I personally am an advocate of limited government, and I think limited government doesn't necessarily mean ineffective government. If we have a quite limited government, we would be assigning, as citizens, we want to assign tasks to government that are really important and that we can't easily do ourselves. And in a limited government, the things that you're going to have government do are very important. So I think we all have an interest in making sure that those things get done well, and so I don't think there's any real conflict here between being a proponent of a very limited role for the government, but then also wanting to make sure that the government can undertake these tasks effectively.
So Tyler Cowen, who's written for the New York Times and is an economist at George Mason University, a very free market economist, he suggested that the potential for a pandemic like this provides a rationale to subsidize or otherwise maybe even provide economic protections for companies that produce vaccines in the U.S. What do you think of this argument? Does it make sense?
Well, it's an interesting argument that he's offered, and essentially what he's saying is, like, imagine the case like we have a global pandemic and there does happen to be a medicine that is able to treat it, or there's a vaccine. And currently, the vaccine makers aren't located in the United States, and so under normal conditions, that's part of a global supply chain, and if it makes more sense for a vaccine maker to locate in Germany or Switzerland or Thailand, then normally that would be a perfectly reasonable thing to do. But when we come to a time of crisis, we just think of ourselves. If we had a company here in the United States that was producing a vaccine or a treatment for a deadly virus that is going around the world, I mean, it's unlikely that our government would allow those doses of that medicine to be shipped out of the United States until we made sure that all Americans were protected. Right. And that seems like a pretty powerful argument. It seems like, and regardless of whether you have contracts in place or a global supply chain, it just seems like a very natural reaction. And I think we understand on a personal level. I mean, if you're trying to protect your family, you would do whatever was necessary to try to protect your family. You see that sort of spilling over, and this just is one of the ways in which I think a pandemic could really affect the organization of our society.
Okay. So people concerned with economic liberty and civic liberty, they struggle with the concept of a quarantine and the rationale for a quarantine. Why are quarantines a problem for someone from a civil libertarian or economic libertarian point of view?
Well, from a libertarian standpoint, libertarians would say that individuals are the source of value in society. So as opposed to people who might take the idea that the group as a whole or the collective is important and individuals are supposed to be, in effect, serving the group. A libertarian is going to take a strong approach that it's individuals that matter. Groups are only important because they're aggregations of individuals. Right. And when you quarantine somebody, when you impose a quarantine, as we have seen with there's a cruise ship where some passengers were exposed to the coronavirus, and that cruise ship is now in quarantine off a port in Japan. And you recognize that, well, the people around that ship and haven't been exposed would like to try to get away, would like to try to protect themselves. And by quarantining them or isolating them, you're preventing people from exercising their personal freedom to try to protect themselves and perhaps their families and loved ones. And That's usually done on the grounds that, well, we have to protect the group. It's to help protect against a virus affecting the group as a whole. And that would be a bad basis from a libertarian standpoint to think of like sacrificing individuals to the needs of the group, in part because once you start doing that, well, where do you draw the line?
Right.
If you say like, okay,
you kill 500 million to save a billion.
Right. Or if we can say like, okay, we can our economy can grow faster if we sacrifice a few individuals. Like, where do you draw the
Right.
line? And so even and so that's highly problematic, I think.
So you have an interesting resolution to this, though. You actually frame it in terms of property rights. So would you say quarantines, isolation, the forced isolation of people can actually be considered an extension of property rights?
I think they could be. I mean, this is something I've thought about for a number of years before this. But I mean, we have public spaces. Mm-hmm. And some of those public spaces are controlled by the government, run by the government, but others are private spaces, like, say, shopping malls, where
right.
That property is privately owned. And some people open up their private property to be public areas, which means that people can enter without special or written permission. And these public spaces are crucial to the operation of our economy. We couldn't have nationwide supply chains, much less global supply chains, unless we had public spaces where people could travel and travel without always getting special permission. So these public spaces, many of which are being run by the government, but sort of on our behalf. If we did have more private property, and we would have public spaces that would be governed by some kinds of complex private forms of organization. But like, for instance, with the shopping mall, I mean, you would likely restrict access to a shopping mall during the times of flu. Or you probably might not let people showing symptoms of a flu come into a privately owned public space. So I think that people would have rights to control who's going to come in and use their spaces, the spaces that they own or the spaces that they're opening up. There would be some conditions that would be put on access to these privately owned public spaces. And I see ultimately, many of these are currently owned by the government, like you think of public roads that actually
right.
belong to the public, but it's really sort of the government acting on our behalf. And so I don't think it's like completely separate. And so I think simply the sort of terms and conditions of the rights for access to public spaces would provide enough of a basis that you could like restrict access, at least in certain circumstances, and give us something like a quarantine. Because I wouldn't have the freedom to come into your house if I was showing signs of sickness. You'd want to protect yourself and your family from exposure, and it just sort of like flows from that.
Okay. Do we need these public spaces for an economy to function?
Yeah, they're crucially important. I mean, you can't, if you think about trying to ship goods and services across town, or across country, or across the globe, we need to have the access to these places.
Okay. Well, aren't you concerned about fears being overblown and then kind of an overreaction? I mean, people will overreact, but couldn't the government overreact as well?
There definitely is the possibility of an overreaction. And I remember one way of putting this is worrying about piranha in the bathtub. And so we could have fears that could end up being overblown. And that's a real possibility. But a part of that's sort of because of the fact that we're in this discovery phase, this discovery process. We don't know if hopefully, knock on wood, hopefully the new coronavirus isn't going to turn into a major pandemic. But we don't know that. And people have fears, and those fears are real, even if the threat ends up never materializing. And I think at some level, I think we sort of like show respect to people if we respect their fears and their concerns and take that into account when we're trying to decide, are we going to restrict access to public spaces? Because we need people to make sure we allow access to public spaces.
Right.
And if we just say you can't put any kind of restrictions on it, regardless of what your fears are, you're simply going to end up with fewer public spaces and a less prosperous economy.
Okay. Well, thanks, Dan.
Well, thanks for coming on and asking the questions. And thanks for joining us. Join us again next time for another EconVersations.